Thank you all for letting me kind of come to present to you. I know that everyone here watching this is in some fashion a early career IO professional, or just starting out, maybe even in some of your graduate education and sort of taking those first steps into it. So my name is Nicholas Baldwin, or you can call me Nick. Today, I wanted to kind of talk to us about how IO psychology, when you start looking around, really is everywhere. And as I say that, I even think to myself, I really want you to sort of just imagine the feeling, if you've ever seen the movie Love Actually, and the guy, Hugh Grant, is sort of narrating, and he says, I think if you look if you look in the right places, you'll realize that love really is all around, right? And that sort of, it really is there. It's everywhere. And IO psychology, I think when we think about it and we look towards it, especially within pop culture where we're going to focus today, IO psychology really is everywhere. It is all around. And so one of the most obvious examples that I think we have is usually in the vein of what we would all refer to as the most popular show streaming wise that has existed. It is the most streamed show or piece of media content, as reported by the Hollywood Reporter for 2020. There was 57.13 billion, that's billion with a B, minutes of The Office that were spent streamed in 2020. That is so astronomically large, okay, that it's even 45% more than the next highest show, which also happens to be a workplace-focused show, Grey's Anatomy. Grey's Anatomy only had 39 billion and change, and The Office has 57 billion minutes. People love watching The Office, and I think that this is a perfect example of we have this innate interest and desire to relate to difficulties of the workplace. One of our single most popular examples of media is something that talks about the difficulties of the workplace. And people who are in the IO psychology career path know very well that that's because we spend a lot of time there. And we can help use The Office as a relatable example to help people understand the topics that we know about, right? I'm sure most of us have had examples where we are trying to communicate some example or some IO psychology related concept, but you use the terms and people aren't familiar with the terms, or sometimes we get bogged down in our acronyms, our CWBs, our OCBs, our AOCs and TJAs, and all the different things that we as IO psychologists may know what those are, but you talk to a random person on the street and they're going to have no idea. However, as I just articulated, you've got a pretty high probability that if you start talking about The Office, then people are going to have an idea of what you're discussing there, and you can find then examples to relate people to it. Another prolific example that I like to share that many people are aware of, although I'm finding these days, if I'm speaking to a younger audience, it doesn't take much time for you to feel generationally old when it comes to popular culture, because I grew up with the movie Office Space being something that everyone who had even a remote interest in IO psychology having watched and using as an example of what IO psychology is. For those of you who are familiar with the movie, the Bobs, and we tell people that's what IO psychology is, and it really works. For those of you not, even if you don't know the movie in particular, you're probably familiar with this guy because he's become a meme in itself, and memes being one of the most recent additions to popular culture, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this hour. So these are examples that everyone sees. And besides Office Space and The Office, the sort of other common ones that come up really frequently when we're talking about IO psychology and IO psychology in movies and popular culture are things like Up in the Air, where George Clooney's flying around being a consultant and helping people to fire people, or Moneyball with Brad Pitt, because he was someone who said, we're not going to go with our gut instincts in sport with regards to who to hire for our baseball team, but instead we are intentionally going to really parcel out what are the elements of being a baseball player and performing certain tasks that we need to sort of round out our whole team. And we will focus only on those elements as opposed to a player as a whole. And that was just such a novel concept in the sport of baseball at the time that it's become something else. But that is an example, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later as well. One starting example where it's IO psychology, even though nobody says it's IO psychology, right? Only people who know IO psychology talk about it as, hey, this is IO. And so that's where I want us to think about that there are other examples like that, we can use ones that are everyone has definitely seen it, or we can use ones that are easy and relatable, right? We as IO psychologists, we are skilled at understanding human behavior at work. We are skilled at understanding how people, work together, communicate, hire, etc. We don't necessarily have the skill of creating cool pieces of visual audio art, right? There's a reason we didn't end up in the television or movie making industry. And so I say, let that be someone else's job. You utilize their skills to supplement yours. So just a little bit of background on myself. As I said, again, I'm Nicholas Baldwin. And, just as to why I might be the one talking to you about this topic today, why I'm interested in it, and why, I might maybe have some small, credibility in regards to being an expert, so to speak, in this. So for starters, I'm a huge nerd. And I just really enjoy communicating and relating to human beings through movies and television. I'm that guy growing up who I would, be quoting movies with friends, and that was kind of our almost subtextual conversation. We would share thoughts and ideas by directly quoting movies and things of that nature. Or I also just am struck with things as I'm in a normal conversation with a person that reminds me about something having to do with some other piece of medium. So, regularly I am in conversations with friends and family members and sort of think of, something from 30 Rock, and I'll have to awkwardly explain to my wife why I'm quietly chuckling to myself. Or even as I'm presenting to you all, the Love Actually example that I gave on the very first title slide genuinely was not planned. It is just something that struck me as I was saying IO is everywhere. That's just how my brain works. All right. I love movies so much that my wife and I even have a podcast, not so shameless plug, In Love with Movies. We like to talk about movies and just how those things inform our view of the world. I'm also a member of the media subcommittee for visibility on PSYOP. So PSYOP is obviously our international organization, the Society for IO Psychology. There are committees regarding different things, and one of them is trying to make our science more visible. And I joined that committee a while ago, and I've been on the subcommittee for 2 or 3 years now, where we try to show IO through all forms of media and get it out there and have more people see it and more people consume it and sort of recognize it when they see it in the media as well. I'm so passionate about this that I also last year or 2 years ago wrote a commentary article for IO Psychology Perspectives talking about using pop culture in the classroom. So this is something when I teach IO psychology. I am a professor at Roosevelt University. I teach in our master's programs of IO, and I teach sometimes our undergrad IO psychology class. When I do those things, I like to use pop culture where I can to help connect with students, right? And yes, that sometimes gets deep eye rolls, but even if you get deep eye rolls for being sort of that old guy who's trying to, relate through memes, there's still a connection that is actually happening. And one of the things that we talk about in that article is there's some evidence to suggest that things are going to click more with your audience, regardless of whether it's a student or whether it is some professional that you're communicating with. If you're trying to talk to a client, what's going to happen if you can create more of a mental mind, right? So our neurons kind of connect with each other and have more density based upon the number of pieces or points in our past and our memories that we connect them to. Now, if I start talking to you about OCBs, if you're someone who's never thought about organizational citizenship behavior before, certainly never heard the term, that's going to mean nothing to you. If I start relating to that to some specific scene from The Office that you may have seen a half a dozen times, all of a sudden now there's a half a dozen touch points for that idea as opposed to this one, right? And so when you create that density of your memory, this is going to make people a little bit more easily able to connect with things. When we start talking about some of the other details here, one of the other places that I've learned some lessons from is what's known as IO Summer Movie Nights. This was something that I did in the summer of 2020. We all had our things that we were trying to do to keep busy and entertain and distract ourselves during the pandemic. This was one that I did. I did discontinue it this past summer, but what IO Summer Movie Nights was an intentional effort to sort of bring people together from across the whole spectrum. We had faculty members who were long in their career. We had individuals who were just looking at going to school for IO psychology, through young professionals, people who were practitioners that were interested in IO psychology, but had kind of started early in their career, were only a couple of years in. So we had the whole gamut of individuals, and we brought them together to watch a movie, some movie that we could somehow relate to IO psychology, and then talk about it and talk about how that happens afterwards. So it's sort of, if you've taken graduate level classes and you had those discussions about an article and what you learned from that article and you bounced ideas off of each other, we did very much that same thing, except we talked about it in the framework of some movie that we had watched together. This is something I had a lot of fun doing last summer, and there were some people that called for it, as I understand. It even came up in some PSYOP at the PSYOP annual conference this past year. Some people were like, hey, there was this thing that somebody did, and we really enjoyed it. And I think that, again, it's because it's that relatability of popular culture. I've already given a bunch of examples, but these are the ones that I mentioned are really easy and a lot of us think of right off the bat. Drop in the chat any IO related concept that you have seen get communicated or shared in a movie that's not already been mentioned, or TV show. Power Rangers, excellent. I love that. That's one I had not thought of. Probably some team dynamics, definitely some leadership. Ooh, making the cut. Yes. Oh, I love that. The idea of being a competitor versus also working together in a team to hit their own goals. The Great British Baking Show. So the Great British Baking Show, one thing I often talk to friends about that I think is fascinating is if you look at competition reality shows that are produced mostly in the United States, there tends to be a lot more of that competition, and we're really trying to pit each other against each other. Whereas something like the Great British Baking Show, even though these people are individuals actively competing against each other, there's a lot more of this sort of we're in this together, and just kindness and helping each other out with the difficulty of the situation. And once my work is done, I'm going to go help you with your work, and those kinds of organizational citizenship behaviors. So the reason I articulate this is, generally speaking, there are these obvious ones that we all think of, right? Office Space, things of that nature. But we also have examples of IO and pop culture that are going to be a lot less noticed. Some examples that come to mind when I start thinking about this question are Ted Lasso. For those of you who maybe watched that new Apple show, I think I've already mentioned 30 Rock in the past. News Radio is another workplace comedy. And then there's also Superstore is a more recent example that I think deals with sort of questions of corporations versus hourly workers, and the sort of making things more automated. And there's lots of great examples that happen there. And these are all examples of some version of a workplace comedy. This is probably the most common place that I see IO topics in popular culture. And that's understandable, right? But something like Ted Lasso, we know when we are at a workplace or when we're in some group of individuals, there's a lot of times still that sort of water cooler atmosphere of within a certain group, there's going to be television shows that just everyone's kind of talking about collectively, right? A couple of years ago, it would have been something like The Walking Dead or Game of Thrones, right? And so right now we've got some others that are really popular. But in addition to these sort of obviously workplace related things, there's IO psychology that exists in a number of these different places, right? So some people might not think about this, but if you've ever seen the movie Super Troopers, you can probably think of, oh yeah, there are a lot of examples of sort of training, employee hazing, dynamics, closings of branches, things of that nature, right? Or 12 Angry Men, right? And this is the idea of emergent leadership, if you're familiar with that at all, and sort of interpersonal conflicts in any given group. My most recent example that I really love talking about is Loki. Loki's a great example of bureaucracy, right? And so if you're in a group of people that are all talking about Loki, when you then want to talk about IO psychology topics, you can easily relate things back to that. Here's an example, just giving you an idea of if you didn't think about, for example, Monsters, Inc. You're like, well, how is Monsters, Inc. at all related to the workplace and IO psychology? Well, I'd encourage you to kind of think about this while we watch this clip.
Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated.
All right, Mr. Bile, is it?
My friends call me Phlegm.
Uh-huh. Mr. Bile, can you tell me what you did wrong?
I fell down?
No, before that. Can anyone tell me Mr. Bile's big mistake? Anyone? Ugh. Let's take a look at the tape. Here we go. Right. There. See? The door. You left it wide open. And leaving the door open is the worst mistake any employee can make because...
It could let in a draft?
It could let in a child.
Oh, Mr. Water News.
There's nothing more toxic or deadly than a human child.
We wouldn't necessarily think of a child's Disney movie, a Pixar movie, as being something that's going to communicate IO psychology topics. But sure enough, there one is, right? So when I'm trying to explain sometimes to students what a full job simulation looks like and why they're potentially very expensive, that is one example that I will use to articulate, right? If you want to have a full job simulation, you're going to have a whole other situation there where you've got, production value, and it's this essentially fake scenario and all of those things. So we can find examples of IO psychology in all sorts of places. I would encourage you to think about why, or like where you can best relate to your given audience at a given time, right? So using Monsters, Inc., for example, is one that I can use these days. But as I articulated earlier, I used to be able to rely on Office Space, and I'd talk about Office Space, and it was just like sort of second nature that everyone immediately knows what I'm talking about. Well, now I've learned that, at least when I'm working with my students, that's not really necessarily an assumption I can make. So that's where you have to adapt things at times. Part of my passion here has also led me to create this Google Doc where there's a number of different popular culture examples. And I love the examples that you all provided for me. Thank you very much. I would encourage you to go ahead and use this Google Doc to add those. This was something we did as a part of that commentary article that I was discussing earlier. And this is just, you can add your suggestions here, and it is a sort of ongoing document of IO psychology existing in popular culture, whether it's TV, movies, possible IO psychology memes, podcasts, books, everything under the sun. So once we kind of know that IO psychology exists in places, that brings us to the idea of how do we use that then to communicate with pop culture, all right? So you want to find some kind of common ground. think about the types of popular culture maybe that your audience is going to be able to relate to. What are the things that they're talking about? If you are a consultant of some kind, maybe be paying attention to your clients and sort of what popular TV show they're watching, right? You have these informal conversations with people and they kind of say, oh, this is what a television show I'm watching. Or you can even sort of innocuously ask, what's everybody watching around here these days? And then you might get some answers that you can then, if you're familiar with that piece of media, relate things through that and kind of give those examples as well. If you have the time, you might even be able to prepare for this in such a way that you can relate to these issues that you see in media. You can share clips like we just did, and you can even allow for time to discuss those clips and maybe break them down and sort of do a, what did they do wrong here? What did they do right? Right. So if we think about The Office, for example, although lots of people have seen it, maybe you want to make sure to remind people of some specific clip. And so you give a 2-minute clip and you say, what went right? What went wrong? What could Michael Scott have done not to be not so much of a dunderhead, right? And these are examples that are going to work much better than, say, sort of the traditional training videos. Okay, I'm sure many of us who've been through any sort of company training and instructional design thing, they may have their own produced videos where they're sort of doing little vignettes, right? And they sort of have the person awkwardly acting out some kind of scenario, and then they stop the video and they say, okay, and what did so and so do right? What did so and so do wrong? Where did they cross the line, as they say? Well, as I mentioned before, we are not good. We're not production people. There's a reason we're not working in the movie industry. So finding those examples are going to be much more engaging and relatable if you find something that's popular culture already as it is. Remember that the pop in pop culture literally means popular. All right. That means that there's lots of people that have watched it. There's lots of people that enjoy watching it. Not only is it going to be easier for people to connect to, but it's going to be easier for people to engage with, even if they've never seen it before. You can also use different skills, right? So this is admittedly leaning a little bit more on my view of teaching and things of that nature. But let's say you're doing some kind of corporate training and you're trying to explain what something like a job analysis is. I do this with students where I say, let's do a superhero job analysis. And you can use that to articulate saying, okay, well, specific superheroes, what are some of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they have? Or are there specific competencies? If we want to go competency model approach, what is some of the baseline necessities for a person to have to be a quote unquote superhero? And that helps people to more easily relate to examples that we can all relate to. When you're doing these kinds of instructions in the classroom, or if you're doing them at a larger corporate setting, you might have people from all kinds of departments. And so you might have people from accounting and people from IT and people from human resources and people from everywhere across the sun. And if there's anything that you're having to help them understand about a given job and trying to explain to them, maybe even just an HR process of why we hire the way that we hire, why do people get paid the way that they get paid, you can help them understand that it starts with a job analysis by helping them understand what a job analysis is, right? You can even articulate the difference between different types, right? So someone generally in accounting might be different from, say, the manager of accounting. And how we articulate that can be articulated through having people sort of walk through these examples that anyone can relate to. And if you're using superheroes, right, these days, pretty much everyone knows what a superhero is. I would say everyone does. And most of them probably know who Iron Man specifically is. And they might even be able to talk about like sort of what are the qualities that Iron Man has that are different from, say, the Hulk or Batman or something along those lines, right? Or similarities for that matter. So those are some examples, and you could do the same kind of things with all types of IO topics. You could do needs assessments where you watch something, in a piece of movie or television, and you then do a needs assessment of like, okay, so practicing the idea of what's going on wrong here, how do we break things down in terms of what are the needs that this organization has, whether it is for designing a training, looking for some sort of performance management, any one of those things. And when you use a popular culture example, those individuals now have a touchstone regardless of where they're coming from, right? Because you're not trying to specify it to something that is related to the job. You are instead trying to make them relate to it on a topic that everyone can relate to. And then in regards to what we know about pedagogy, we know that having that easy touch point, then you can ask people to extrapolate beyond that. So you have one that everyone can relate to, and then you might give them the additional task of, okay, now try to go do that with, your own job or things of that nature. Last Dance Good example of needs assessment. Thank you very much. Yeah. The Last Dance is absolutely. I assume we're talking about the sports ESPN documentary. Thank you. So that's something you can do, and people then can sort of understand what we're talking about there. And it's a cultural touch point that you don't have to try to explain in regards to abstracts. Anytime a human being is being asked to understand a new concept, teaching it to them in the abstract is very difficult. It's hard for our brains to kind of tackle that early on. In fact, younger individuals, as we're sort of learning and developing, we literally can't, right? But that difficulty happens later on. And I'm sure most of us can relate to the fact, if you've ever been a part of your own training, that you are being trained, or if you've ever conducted your own training or instructional design of any kind, it's hard to get people to care, and the motivation is not there. When motivation is not there, it's hard, because motivation gives us more cognitive energy. If you're trying to tackle an abstract concept, all right, then it's going to be difficult because it takes more cognitive energy to tackle an abstract construct. If I'm therefore wanting to go an abstract construct, I'm going to make it more difficult, and more motivation is required. If motivation is not there, the concept won't click. If you can remove some of those barriers by making it less abstract and having concrete examples that people can relate to, and making sure that you direct them in the way you want them to, that's going to help you out a lot. And in some situations, you might even be able to sort of assign homework, right? You might say, watch this movie or this television show episode prior to coming to things. There are also, I want to point out, lots of examples where IO psychology is being discussed and nobody says the word IO. So things that are also popular just more broadly to an audience, but maybe people don't say the term IO psychology. Some of us are familiar with Adam Grant. He is a member of Psych, and he calls himself an organizational psychologist, but he doesn't necessarily get into some of the nitty-gritties of things. That's great, because it brings a lot more eyeballs to things, and there's more people that might be familiar with Adam Grant who would have no idea what the word IO psychology means. And so you can sort of say, oh, well, that's the same thing. I'd say similar to Freakonomics Radio. For those of us who are familiar with Freakonomics, the books, and then the podcast and the radio show, all those things, deals with mostly behavioral economics. Behavioral economics, people don't remember a lot of times, the individual who won the Nobel Prize for economics that then sort of spawned the idea for the show Freakonomics and the term behavioral economics, that individual actually was a classically trained psychologist, right? So they got a Nobel Prize in economics, but it's because of them doing work in psychology about how human beings relate to each other. So people may know what Freakonomics is, but then you can say, yeah, well, a lot of that is also basically what we do in IO psychology. So these are things that you can find. I also then looked, I've seen some episodes of Stuff You Should Know, or other podcasts, Curiosity Daily and other things like that, where they end up discussing very work-related topics and psychology and IO psychology work-related topics without ever necessarily using that term. Stuff You Should Know is among the top 10 most downloaded podcasts that exist. So there's a lot of people that also listen to that. Find some examples there that you might be able to use. Then similarly, I mentioned, Ted Lasso in the past, or I said Moneyball will come back up. There's a lot of examples in popular culture that are still within the sort of TV and movie realm of things that, again, people don't think of as IO, even though that's exactly what's going on, right? The Moneyball example, we know we've got different dynamics that are happening there. Pretty much any sports movie that you can think of, The Replacements, Major League, League of Their Own, there are all these examples that are really all about the IO related topics. Stretching the idea a little bit further, there's even some sort of workplace situations within regards to the TV show, the popular show, The Good Place. And that show's really dealing with a lot of in-depth ethical questions and the ideas of sort of what priorities should one have in a given situation. And it's all put in this context of essentially a bureaucracy that exists. And you can talk about how there are ethical dilemmas that come up in our work. Now, they might not usually deal with the all existence of humanity, but they might feel like they do sometimes. And that's really similarly important to sort of recognize that that can be a difficult ethical dilemma. Other words are sort of crisis management, right? In the TV show Chernobyl, or motivation and teams and sort of team dynamics that exist in the Suicide Squad movies, to give one that kind of comes up more recently, right? And so motivation is a great example within Suicide Squad. If you're trying to articulate sort of the idea of positive and negative reinforcements and other incentives, right? Because Suicide Squad is a classic example, for those of you who don't know, of carrot and stick, right? So the Suicide Squad, if you go on this journey with them, it's a really, really risky thing. You're very likely to die. 50% of everyone, doesn't come back. It's obviously a farcical example, but you might get significant time off your prison sentence. That's your carrot. Your stick is if you, go on the mission, but then try to run away, or you don't complete the mission, or don't do it the way that we tell you to, we're going to literally, set off a bomb inside your head. Like, these are obviously crazy comic book examples, but you can easily see now the understanding between, okay, here's carrot, here's stick. And if you have people that you're trying to say, well, let's then think about what would be the carrot or the stick in your job, right? So these are things to consider. A quick note on copyright issues. So I mentioned that I did IO movie nights last summer, had a blast with it. Part of the reason I ended up not doing it again this summer is, while there was no real legal issues or nobody came after me or anything for having done it last year, part of the way I did it last year was essentially saying, it's no different than a small group of me and my friends sort of choosing to watch a movie together and streaming it over Discord. It was fun and it was popular, but I've discovered since then that there are some legal ramifications that someone could, so to speak, come after you. So if you use the names, so let's say you're trying to promote some kind of event where you're doing something like using popular media to communicate IO psychology topics, you can do so within your, sort of corporate setting. Absolutely. Just make sure that, you're not using the names on any kind of LinkedIn post or social media. For those of you who are familiar with IO Movie Nights, you know that like we violated this rule very much, and I'm glad no one has come after me for it. Additionally, wherever possible, I would recommend using clips like I did here for using Monsters, Inc. That is an example of, you can then get away with certain things about commentary or parody or evaluation and review. Those clips make it, much more easy for you to get away with not having violated any kind of copyright law, as opposed to doing an IO movie night where you watch the entire length of something. If you do want to watch the length of something, you probably want to make sure that you get some licensing purchased. This is one company that, for example, can do that, where you essentially, you go and you pay them X amount of dollars, depending upon the circumstances, to either have a blanket annual ability to sort of stream or share any of their full content, or else you can do for single viewings and special events for smaller amounts of money. But essentially, for you to really be covered and not have anyone kind of come after you for running a illegal theater experience, you would need to make sure to get that licensed. So that's just a quick little note, both because I felt a need to address the IO Summer Movie Nights, and also because I want people to be aware of that, because I don't want you to make mistakes that could get you in trouble in ways that I have luckily avoided so far. So in addition to movies and TV, there are other forms of popular culture, right? There's obviously all kinds of popular culture out there. And I want to encourage you to think about how those things relate to IO psychology as well. Some people will relate things directly to IO psychology. For example, in regards to memes, there is an excellent Twitter follow and Instagram follow. They're the same at, if you want it. It's at IO Psych Memes. That's Psych, PSYCH, Psych Memes, IO Psych Memes. Great brilliance there, in my opinion, run by a faculty member from San Diego State. But one of the things about memes is it's fascinating in a way to connect with a group of people, because memes are becoming so prolific at this point that they're almost the modern chain email, right? So for even the older people and older generations, like myself and older, are able to relate to memes, because if you have a Facebook, if you have any kind of social media, you probably see some memes. And as long as you don't go too deep into sort of the meme culture of its own culture, then you can really kind of have people relate to it. The other reason memes work with regards to the pop culture conversation is memes are a form of pop culture, but they also almost always rely on some already existing popular culture, right? So there's some clip from a movie or some screenshot from a TV show or something like that that is used to articulate the point that is being made. And it is usually in the form of taking that known thing and adjusting it in some way, or putting a different caption on it or something along those lines, that then creates the relatable thing. But sort of being familiar with the context of the image itself is necessary then for you to be communicating the thing. So, I would encourage you, if you're good at making memes, do that yourself. If you're not, like me, I'm terrible at making memes. I don't know how to. I'm too much of an old fuddy-duddy to learn. But there are ones out there that exist. TikTok is another example. People do all kinds of things on TikTok, and TikTok is the #1 most downloaded piece of application social media in 2020. So TikTok is blowing up. And yes, there's a bunch of old people on there as well. Sorry, Generation Z, you're going to have to find the next one because us millennials have come for it already, and we are all on there watching it with you. There are people doing all kinds of things on TikTok. So you can talk about the specific trends if you see one that is at all related to work. I see individuals often, there's sort of this trend of like, let me tell you about my day, or real conversations that I've had at my workplace, working for sports, working at the airport, working at as a waitress, all kinds of these things. And so these TikTok videos sometimes go viral, or get seen by a lot of individuals, and it's just people talking about the workplace. And you can use that as examples of like, hey, here's this IO psychology topic that relates to that as well. There's also books, music. There's people singing about how much they, like or dislike their jobs all the time. We have music that talks, these ballads involving, following leaders and things of that nature. Up in my office, I have a book I was going to bring. There's even individuals, Michael Urick, Urick, Michael Urick has a series of books that he's creating right now that is a manager's guide to blank. And so the first one that came out, I think, was a manager's guide to using the force. Another one is sort of a manager's guide to something having to do with the Lord of the Rings. I forget the actual title now, but it is the idea of, hey, these things, these popular culture existence, right? Star Wars, so big, right? That people who've never seen the movies are familiar enough with some of the basic concepts that if you briefly explain a specific scene from Star Wars, they have the groundwork for you to then be able to say, hey, this thing that happens in this scene, it is like this thing that happens in the workplace. And let's then talk about and relate to that, how it relates to your particular workplace. And so that's some awesome work that I recommend finding as well. Any one of these settings, right? Consider your audience. There might be people who are going to be much more likely to relate to a book like Mr. Urick's, where they're discussing sort of, they want a physical book and they can read about it. And then they maybe, larger media that's sort of largely popular. If you're working with people that are much more avid memers or TikTok followers, you might be able to find more examples there, right? Think about who you're talking to. If it's a room full of sectagenarian, cis, straight white men, maybe memes and TikTok wouldn't be the absolute best source of popular culture to relate to. However, they've probably seen 12 Angry Men, right? So you can talk about those things as well. And then you can also practice these things on various social medias. The only consideration I would give you there is when you're working on sort of communicating ideas, you might maybe want to tweet about or write about on a blog post for LinkedIn, or you share some thoughts on Facebook, or you sort of say, oh, I related to this. You can sort of almost like you would practice stand-up, right? You sort of use the hive mind and see who relates to what concepts. And if it gets well received, gets a lot of likes, gets a lot of mentions, then that's something kind of strikes a chord with people and people relate to. And then maybe you can use that in a more formal, organizational job setting of sorts. And are there any questions?
Yes, I have a lot of questions. I was writing down notes, sorry.
Love it.
One, great presentation. I was finding it relieving because the way that you talk, like the way that you were teaching pop culture and IO is what I realized what got me into the IO. Because I had a professor that kind of did the same thing you did, where he draw in clips from The Office and draw in different sports analogies, because a lot of my classes, we had like the sports athletes. So like it was easy to relate to that in the IO realm. And like, that's the stuff that I really gravitated towards. And I realized that a lot of students gravitate towards as something that you mentioned relatability wise, right?
Sure.
So in that regard, how do you encourage your students? Because like now I would say like we're in the social media realm where it's kind of like, oh, we kind of have to be online to kind of be known for something. So like, how do you encourage your students to go out and practice like like your thought process of like how to articulate these stories in a way that's relatable in pop culture, that's relatable to their peers, and like vice versa and stuff like that. So like, how do you do that? Like, can you give me like some examples or exercises that you do?
So you mean that last point, for example, that I was making? That's what you're asking about, Trenton?
Yeah.
The practicing it? Okay. So, I mean, I would encourage, just sort of float the boat and see what happens, right? Like you mentioned, there's always sort of an online presence. I think that's the reason I gave the caution of like thinking about what platform you're on, paying attention to things like the platform, Facebook, I feel like, is sort of the internet of all things at this point, where we relate and stay connected to our relatives, but maybe aren't that active. At least that's what it is for me. So knowing that there's maybe a different audience there might matter. Whereas, Twitter's a little bit more democratic in the sense of everything. Instagram obviously is sort of visually focused. So those might be places to consider things. But, early days of Twitter, there were people that would sort of float jokes. They would kind of like just literally put the text of a joke and see if people, relate to it or things of that nature. And I would encourage you to kind of do some of that. Even is just like, think about who your audience is, think about what things, kind of get, I would say, have very low standards in terms of what qualifies, right? It doesn't have to be something that goes completely viral for you to feel like it was a successful joke or that people related or talked about it. Look for metrics like, do people comment? Do people say, yes, I've totally been there before? As opposed to sort of like, 1,000 views or more than that even. It's a saturated environment, so keep that in mind. But really, it's an opportunity to sort of, it's just sort of an idea that I brought up even here, and it's not something I've really pushed too hard. So I'll be frank and say I don't know how much thought I've given to it, but I would say it's the idea here of giving an opportunity to see whether or not it works in a sort of low stakes environment, right? Whether someone agrees with you on social media, as long as you're not saying something inflammatory or derogatory or insensitive, which I would encourage everyone to not do in any facet of their lives. Just don't do that on social media, period. As long as you're not doing those things, then what's the harm? You know what I mean? Like you will find out whether people connect with it or not. And then that way, whether you can kind of take it into a room. And you could also even pay attention to like, maybe I post the same thing on 3 different platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and sort of see who connects with it in different places, right? And so maybe it's like all of my older family members that connect with this idea over on Facebook. And now I know maybe there's a specific audience that concept, that joke, that relationship, that piece of social media, or that piece of popular culture resonates with that group of people, as opposed to, something that resonates on TikTok is going to be a completely different, probably, group of individuals that it resonates with. All right. I have a tendency to talk too long, so I'm going to stop speaking there and wait for the next question.
Yeah, that last slide resonated with me too, kind of like brought the whole presentation home. At my online hub for my business was Instagram. And I don't know if what I create memes, but I create like graphics related to IO.
Sure.
And I was also throwing things on LinkedIn. And then all of a sudden things started getting traction on LinkedIn. And so I just, did some testing and then figured out what worked on LinkedIn, and still throw them on Instagram and Facebook, but I don't expect to get any interaction from them there. So it's just interesting because not only did I find what worked, but it adjusted. Like, my home for my business is LinkedIn now.
Any other questions?
Yes. One of them relates to you say you're a member of visibility and media in the subcommittee for Psych.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting to me, where it's like when I got into IO, I had this dream, if you will, where I want to bring IO to the world. But I noticed that the biggest thing that we as IO psychologists or practitioners do is not have accessible knowledge or accessible information that relates to people. Because and like how I saw PSYOP is like, we come together, we have these language, but then when it's the outside world, it's like, they're like, huh? Like, what do you mean? So like, what is like your particular roles within like this particular committee? Because I would love to be like, contribute to anything that this committee is doing, because I feel as though like that's just like a one step into the next direction of like how to make IO stand out in just like relatable culture in general.
Anyone who's watching, I would strongly encourage you to get involved in PSYOP and get involved in committees and subcommittees and volunteer opportunities. Especially if you're earlier in your career, there's ways that you can volunteer to supplement the cost of going to PSYOP. That's a great way to get to know people and network and all those kinds of things. You do need to be a member to officially volunteer for anything. So you have to be up on your dues with regards to that. As of August 12th, I want to say the window for officially volunteering for this next year has closed. We just recently sort of filled our slate of volunteers among those people who are interested. However, I know that we have lots of work to do, and we are trying to be as prolific of a subcommittee as possible, and we're doing all sorts of things. So I would encourage you to, if it's at all possible, still go sign up and prioritize which subcommittees you want to be a part of. There are lots of subcommittees in visibility that are doing all kinds of things to bring PSYOP and our science to the awareness of other individuals. The media subcommittee, particularly, the big things that we do is we help out with, and there's a lot of committees doing this, but we help out with September being Smarter Workplace Awareness Month. So you might see me throwing up some hashtags of #SWAM, Smarter Workplace Awareness, during the month of September. That's going to be one of the things that I'm helping to kind of push that. In addition to that, the committee always has kind of been in charge of the survey and then analysis of top 10 trends. So we put together, if you look on PSYOP's website or if you look on their social media and you see the top 10 work trends, as our members have seen it, that's my committee that puts that together. We also this year have tried to push that initiative a little further by creating sort of trend champions. And so we have found people in practice or in academia to really champion that idea, and once every quarter come up with sort of, this is a trend and here's where members of PSYOP or people are talking about it in the media in this trend. So from January to March, here's some ways that people were talking about learning remotely and things of that nature, all the different trends that you can find on PSYOP's website. And then finally with that is we do try to reach out to different media outlets and are constantly trying to also do that, but as it's a volunteer and we're all working full time, this is usually something that's a skill set we don't all necessarily have and it's not awesome, but trying to get onto other podcasts or trying to get PSYOP noticed and have inroads and connections with people who work in all forms of media, whether that is sort of news outlets, publishers, people who write books, individuals who work in the movie making and television industries. Man, I would love, I'm not going to be able to be on this committee after this year, but I would have loved to have gotten the word IO psychology said on a primetime television show at some point for some reason. Be like, oh, he's an IO psychologist. They study these things and that's how we know workplace, this, that, and the other. Because there's just, as I give all kinds of examples, we talk about it, which nobody says it. So yeah, that's the answer to that question about regards to the specific media subcommittee. Visibility is largely concerned with all kinds of things, making PSYOP more visible as a whole. So I encourage everyone watching this to go find the committees that you'd be interested in volunteering for.
I think we're probably good to wrap up at that point. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you coming, speaking with us on this very interesting and fun topic and giving us ideas about how we can share to our networks and help push out the word about IOs.
Excellent. Thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. Hopefully some people sparked some ideas here. And I'm always love talking about these things. That's why you can tell I just love to talk in general as well. So if you want to talk more with me about these things, please feel free to find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or you can even just shoot me an email. And I'm always happy to continue that conversation with anyone who's interested.